She wasn't the kind of woman men wrote songs about. She wasn't the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it go quiet. She was the kind of woman who refilled the coffee before anyone noticed it was empty, who had the quarterly reports on your desk before you knew you needed them, who remembered that the Kowalski account required invoices in triplicate because their comptroller was old-fashioned and difficult, and who never, not once in 3 years, made you feel like any of that was beneath her. That was Nell Pruitt, and for 3 years Dorian Vance had looked straight through her, not because he was a cruel man. Cruelty, in Dorian's world, was a tool, deliberate, precise, deployed when necessary. What he felt toward Nell wasn't cruelty. It was something far more insulting, nothing at all. She was 31 years old, soft in the way that made most men in his world look away, with wide brown eyes behind frameless glasses that she pushed up her nose when she was thinking hard, which was almost always. She wore cardigans in colors that had no business being called colors. Taupe ecru, something she once described as dusty sage that looked, to Dorian, like the wall of a government building. She kept her dark hair twisted up at the back of her head in a way that seemed to involve a single pencil doing the structural work. And she never wore heels because she'd told Reyes once, within earshot of Dorian, that she'd rather be comfortable than memorable. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. He thought about it later, much later, in the back of a black car outside a restaurant called Cassini's, watching through plate glass as Nell Pruitt laughed at something a man in a grey suit was saying across a candlelit table, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that had no place in his chest. It started the way most things in his life started, with information he hadn't asked for. Dorian Vance ran the Vance Syndicate from the 44th floor of a building he technically didn't own, in a city that technically didn't know his name. He dealt in shipping logistics, in import licenses, in the kind of bureaucratic grey areas that lawyers charged $400 an hour to explain, and judges chose not to examine too closely. He had a legitimate holding company, a less legitimate consulting firm, and a network of favors so deep and interlocking that even he sometimes forgot where the debts ended and the loyalty began. What he did not have, ever, was a Friday night without something burning. It was Reyes who told him. Reyes, his head of operations, who had the emotional intelligence of load-bearing concrete and the observation skills of a man who'd spent 12 years not getting killed. "Your accountant," Reyes said, appearing in the doorway of Dorian's office at 6:30 on a Tuesday, "has a date Friday." Dorian didn't look up from the contract he was reading. "Which accountant?" "The one who found the Harwick discrepancy." He looked up then. There was only one person in this building who'd found the Harwick discrepancy. 3 auditors before her had missed it entirely. Nell had found it in 40 minutes on her 3rd day, and had presented her findings with the quiet, methodical precision of someone diffusing a bomb. Not because she was nervous, but because she understood the weight of what she was handing him. "Why?" Dorian said carefully. "Are you telling me this?" Reyes shrugged with one shoulder. "You told me to flag scheduling conflicts. She's asked for Friday evening off. Said she has plans. That's not a scheduling conflict, Reyes. She's also the only one who knows where the Marchetti files live. They're in the system. The real Marchetti files." Dorian set down his pen. That was a fair point. Nell had developed what she called her parallel filing system, which was her polite way of saying she kept a second set of records that were accurate, as distinct from the first set, which were legal. She'd never been asked to do this. She'd simply understood that it was necessary and had done it, and now the only person who could navigate the parallel system with any fluency was Nell herself. "Give her Friday," he said, "and tell her I need the Ferraro summary by Thursday noon." Reyes nodded and left. Dorian looked back at his contract and read the same sentence 4 times without retaining a single word. He didn't know why he was thinking about it. He had no reason to think about it. Nell Pruitt's personal life was none of his concern, had never been his concern, and would remain that way because that was how it had always been and how it needed to stay. She was excellent at her job. She was, arguably, the most competent person in this building who wasn't actively involved in anything that could get her arrested. He valued that. He protected that. He'd had 3 separate conversations with men who'd spoken to her in tones he considered inappropriate, and those men now worked in separate cities. But that was professional. That was maintenance of a functional work environment. He went home at 9 and ate dinner alone, and watched the news without watching it, and at some point he fell asleep in the chair, and in the morning, everything was exactly as it had been, which was how he preferred things. The Ferraro summary was on his desk by 10 Thursday morning. It was 40% more thorough than he'd expected, and included a margin note in Nell's handwriting. She always printed her annotations by hand, in a small, precise script that read, "The Ferraro secondary holding appears to have a silent partner not listed in the filed documents. I've flagged it, but haven't gone further. Your call." He read it twice. Then he wrote "dig deeper" on a sticky note and walked it to her office himself, which he had done exactly once before in 3 years, and slid it under the door because she wasn't there. He didn't know why he'd walked it himself. Friday came and went. Dorian had dinner with a business associate named Lindqvist, who was visiting from Stockholm and who spoke in long, measured sentences about port access and tariff structures. And Dorian listened and responded appropriately, and at no point did he think about Nell Pruitt. This was a lie. He thought about it twice. Once when Lindqvist's assistant, a young woman who sat behind him with a tablet and spoke only when addressed, refilled their water without being asked, and Dorian found himself thinking, briefly and without explanation, that Nell would have had the Lindqvist briefing memorized by now and wouldn't need a tablet at all. And once when Lindqvist said, of something unrelated, "The things that run smoothest are the things you stop noticing," and Dorian had found himself setting down his fork. He got into the car at 9:15. He told his driver, Machetti's cousin Gio, to take the long route back because he wanted to think. They were passing through the restaurant district, the good block, the one with the places that didn't take reservations and didn't need to. When he saw her, he almost didn't. She was through plate glass, at a corner table near the window, and she was. She was not in ecru. She was in a deep burgundy dress with off-the-shoulder sleeves that did something he didn't have words for, and her hair was down, dark and loose around her shoulders, and she was laughing. Not the small, polite laugh she used in meetings. Something real. Something that came from somewhere behind her sternum and made her whole face change. The man across from her was lean and pleasant-looking, late 30s, good suit, the kind of man who played racquetball and had strong opinions about single malt scotch. He was leaning forward slightly, animated, clearly trying to be interesting. And Nell was watching him with those wide brown eyes, but not the way she watched Dorian's contracts. She was watching him like she was genuinely entertained. "Stop the car," Dorian said. Gio stopped the car. They sat there for 40 seconds, long enough for Dorian to observe that the restaurant was Cassini's, which was 3 blocks outside his usual territory, and had a wine list he'd been told was worth the commute. Long enough to observe that the table had a candle on it, and that someone had ordered what appeared to be a shared appetizer, which implied this had been going on long enough for appetizers. Long enough to observe that Nell was wearing lipstick. He had never, in 3 years, seen her wear lipstick. "Sir," Gio said, "give me a minute." He did not need a minute. What he needed was to go home. What he needed was to acknowledge that this information, Nell Pruitt, Friday night, Cassini's, burgundy dress, lipstick, racquetball man, was irrelevant to him and to the functioning of the Vance Syndicate and to anything else he could legitimately claim as his concern. Instead, he said, "Is there anything on the Cassini account?" Gio glanced in the rearview mirror. The restaurant? Yes. I'd have to check, sir. Dorian looked at the window. The man was saying something now. Nell was listening. She tucked one side of her hair back behind her ear, an unconscious gesture, and nodded slowly in the way she did when she was actually processing something, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. He'd noticed that about her once. The difference between her listening and her waiting. He hadn't thought about what it meant that he'd noticed. Don't bother, he said. Drive. He went home. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon and didn't drink it. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the city and was honest with himself for approximately 4 minutes about what was happening inside his chest. It felt like something being corrected. The way you feel when you've been sitting slightly wrong for a long time, and you finally shift, and your spine says there. Except that it was uncomfortable, this correction, because it implied that something had been wrong without his knowledge, and Dorian Vance did not care for things that had been happening without his knowledge. He went to bed and slept badly and was in the office by 7, which was not unusual, except that at 7:14, he walked past Nell's office and observed that her light was already on and her door was ajar. And he could hear the faint sound of her typing, which was rapid, and even in the way that meant she was thinking clearly and working well, he kept walking. He called Reyes at 7:30. The man at Cassini's last night, he said, without preamble. A pause. Sir, with our accountant. I'm not aware of anyone I should have been watching at Cassini's. Sir, find out who he is, he quietly. There was a longer pause. Is there a business reason? There's a security reason. Nell has access to sensitive documents. I need to know who's in her personal life. This was plausible. It was also, and Dorian was aware of this with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable. Not the only reason. Reyes came back at noon. The man's name was Whitmore. Hugh Whitmore, 39, commercial real estate. Absolutely no connection to anyone in Dorian's world. Clean record, co-owned a Labradoodle with his sister, and Reyes delivered this last piece with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was handling something delicate. Met Nell at a cooking class 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks? That's all, Dorian said. He read the Ferraro secondary holding report that Nell had expanded, and felt nothing. About Hugh Whitmore, a man who co-owned a dog and had been eating appetizers with Nell Pruitt for 6 weeks, while Dorian had been running his empire in complete ignorance. The following Tuesday, Nell came in wearing a cardigan the color of a storm cloud, which was the most dramatic thing she'd worn to the office in recent memory, and she had a small smile on her face that she wasn't aware of, the kind you carry without meaning to, and Dorian noticed it from across the open floor and said nothing, and went into his office and closed the door with more force than was necessary. Reyes appeared 20 minutes later. Marchetti's people want to move the Thursday meeting, he said. Fine, to Cassini's. Dorian looked at him. It's a neutral location, Reyes said, with the absolute straight face of a man who had been in this business long enough to know better than to have expressions. They suggested it. Use Langans. Marchetti's people don't like Langans. Marchetti's people, Dorian said, don't have to like anything. Reyes nodded and left. Dorian looked at the window. The small storm cloud cardigan smile was none of his business. Hugh Whitmore and his Labradoodle were none of his business. 6 weeks of cooking classes and shared appetizers at Cassini's were none of his business. Nell Pruitt's Friday nights, and her Thursday nights, for that matter, and her Saturday mornings, and every hour she spent outside this building, were none of his business, had never been his business, and the fact that he was devoting this much internal real estate to the question was a problem he intended to resolve by simply not thinking about it. He was, it turned out, not very good at not thinking about it. 3 weeks later, the Ferraro situation escalated. The silent partner Nell had flagged turned out to be a man named Breck. No first name anyone could find, just Breck. who was operating through 4 shell companies and had been quietly skimming from a freight account that technically sat adjacent to Vance territory without being in it. It wasn't theft from Dorian, not exactly, but it was the kind of thing that required a response, both for practical and philosophical reasons. Dorian handled it on a Wednesday evening, quietly, efficiently, in the way that such things were handled. He came back to the office afterward because he had nowhere else to be, and because the building was empty at 11 p.m., and he thought more clearly in empty buildings. He was standing at the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled when he heard the elevator. He turned. Nell was standing in the doorway of his office. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair down, glasses on, and she was holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the 24-hour place on the corner. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I saw the lights," she said. "I was coming back for my laptop charger, and I saw the lights. You don't have to be here. I know." She set one of the cups on the edge of his desk. "The Breck situation?" He nodded. Did it resolve cleanly? He looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, without the micro-calculation he saw in most people who asked him questions like that. The ones who were always measuring how much to know versus how much deniability to keep. Nell just asked, because she'd already made her choice, 3 years ago, about how much she was willing to understand. "Cleanly enough," he said. She nodded, pulled over the chair across from his desk. Not the formal one people sat in during meetings, but the low one in the corner that nobody used, and sat down, curling one leg underneath her, and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "You should go home," he said. "You should go home," she said. He almost smiled. He didn't, but almost. They were quiet for a while, in the way that 2 people are quiet when they've been in proximity, long enough that the silence is not uncomfortable, just present. The city outside was doing what it always did at this hour, less frantic, still awake, the lights on the water going somewhere in the dark. "The Ferraro report," he said. "The margin note. The silent partner. Yeah, how did you know to flag it?" She pushed her glasses up. The numbers on the secondary holding were too round. Real transactions are messy. These were neat, like someone had cleaned them up. She looked at her cup. When numbers are too clean, someone's hiding something. He'd been in this business for 20 years and had paid experts in 4 countries to find that for him. Nell had found it in a margin note on a Thursday morning. "You're wasted here," he said, before he could stop himself. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not hurt exactly, but something in that neighborhood. "I don't mean that the way it sounded," he said. "I mean, you could be anywhere. You could be at a firm, a real firm. I know." She looked back at the window. "I like it here." "Why?" A pause. "The work is real." He understood that. In his world, everything was real. The consequences were real. The errors were real. The stakes were real. There was something clarifying about that, even when it was terrible. "Nell," he said. She looked at him. He didn't know what he was going to say. He'd said her name with the full intention of following it with something, and then found that the something had departed without warning. He stood there, jacket on the arm of his chair, sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a paper cup of coffee at 11:15 on a Wednesday, looking at a woman in a blue sweater who had found his hidden problem in a margin note and brought him coffee because she saw his lights on. "The man from Cassini's," he said. Her expression changed. "How do you know about that?" "I was passing." She studied him. "You were passing Cassini's." "My driver took a different route. Gio takes whatever route you tell him." He said nothing. She looked at him for a long, precise moment, in the way she looked at numbers that didn't add up. Not accusatory, just gathering information, assembling it into a shape she could understand. "His name is Hugh," she said carefully. "He's in commercial real estate. He's very nice." "I know." Her eyebrows moved. "You know, security," he said. "You have access to sensitive materials. I needed to know who you were spending time with." Nell was quiet for a moment. Then she uncurled her leg and stood up, which made her about 5'4" without heels, which was considerably shorter than Dorian, and which had never, before this precise moment, seemed particularly relevant. "That's not why you looked him up," she said. He held her gaze. "No." She stood very still. "What are you doing, Dorian?" It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. Vance, and they both knew it. He set his coffee cup down on the desk, slowly, because he was a man who did things deliberately. "I looked at the window," he said, "and you were wearing a red dress, and you were laughing, and I—" He stopped, found the words, which were not the kind of words he was accustomed to using. "I didn't like it." "You didn't like what?" "That I didn't know. That he made you laugh like that, and I didn't know the sound of it. That you have a Friday night, and it was a complete surprise to me." He looked at her. "That should not have been a surprise to me." Nell looked at him for a very long time. Her expression was impossible to read, which was unusual. Usually he was good at reading people, but Nell had always been slightly opaque to him in ways that he'd never examined before now. "I've worked for you for 3 years," she said. "I know. You have never once asked me if I wanted coffee. You have never once asked how my weekend was. You walked this sticky note to my door last month, which you have never done before, and I thought about it for 3 days trying to figure out what had changed." He said nothing. "You looked me up," she said. "You investigated Hugh." "Yes, because you were jealous." The word sat in the air between them. He didn't deny it. "Dorian." She said his name again, and again they both registered it. I'm not. I don't look like the women you—" "Don't," he said. His voice came out sharper than he intended. She stopped. He made himself say the rest more carefully. "Don't tell me what I think." Her chin lifted slightly. "I know what I think," he said. "I know what I've been not thinking about for the past 3 weeks, and I know what I was not thinking about for the 3 years before that, which is a different problem. I know what I felt when I told Gio to stop the car." He held her gaze. "I know what I feel right now." The building was very quiet. Outside, the city went on being itself. In the office, on the 44th floor, 2 cups of coffee cooled slowly on a desk, and Nell Pruitt looked at Dorian Vance with those wide, precise brown eyes and did not look away. "Hugh is very nice," she said again. Quietly, not as a defense, more like she was setting something down. "I know, he's uncomplicated. I know that too. You're not uncomplicated." "No," he said. "I am not." She pushed her glasses up. It was the gesture he'd catalogued without meaning to. The one that meant she was thinking, assembling, arriving at a conclusion with the same systematic care she brought to everything else. "If I say yes to this," she said, with characteristic directness, "whatever this is, that changes everything. My job. She stopped. "Everything. Yes. You understand that I'm not going to disappear quietly if it doesn't work." He almost smiled again. He kept it inside this time too, but it was closer. "I know. And you understand that I'll tell you when the numbers are wrong. About anything. Not just the accounts. I'm counting on it." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she reached out and picked up her coffee cup, the one she'd set aside when she stood, and held it in both hands again. It was a gesture that meant she was staying. He'd learned that without knowing he'd learned it. "Okay," she said. He exhaled slowly. Not in relief, exactly. In the way you exhale when something clicks into the right place and you understand, for the first time, how wrong it had been sitting before. "The Marchetti files," she said, in the tone she used when she was moving on to the next thing. "The secondary partition. I'm reorganizing it. The current structure is inefficient." "All right. And you need to eat something. You look like you've been up since 5. That's worse." She glanced at the door. "There's a place on the corner that does eggs at this hour. I know because I've been there 3 times this month." He picked up his jacket. "At this hour? The work is real," she said, and this time there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth. "I told you." He followed her to the elevator. They stood side by side waiting for it. and the silence was the same silence as before. Comfortable, present, not requiring anything, except that now he was aware of it differently. The way you become aware of a sound once someone names it. The elevator arrived. They got in. The doors closed on the 44th floor and opened on the lobby. Nell walked slightly ahead of him through the glass doors and into the night air, and he watched her for a half-second before following. The dark hair, the blue sweater, the competent set of her shoulders, and thought about how she'd refilled his coffee 3 years ago before he knew he needed it, and how he'd looked straight through her, and how the thing he'd missed had not, in fact, gone anywhere. It had just been waiting, the way good numbers do, for someone to finally look.